For the last 10 years, immigration has been at the top of the list of the most important issues facing the United States. And one of the experts who has been working on this issue for decades, has been extremely influential, is Center Immigration Studies' Mark Krikorian. In this week's episode, we're going to have our first guest, and it is a must listen. We talk about the changing dynamics of immigration, the difference between Europe and the United States, the imperative of assimilation, and particular tactics the Trump administration can use to reduce the number of illegal immigrants in this country. We're going to be getting into all of this and more after the break. Mark, I'm really excited to talk to you, and we've been talking about your work on the show since we launched a number of weeks ago. And it really seems to be the case that immigration has been the underlying force in American politics over the last decade, thanks mostly to President Trump, who brought it back into the conversation in a totally new way. The headlines recently are about Somali fraud, about kind of looting the Treasury of Minnesota. But can you help us just set the frame and tell viewers who may not have been tuned into it, like, what are the big stakes? What are the big changes? What are the big stories about immigration that have changed over the past decade?
Well, the big fact is the numbers. As for some reason, disgraced Enoch Powell always used to say, numbers are of the essence. And we have now gotten not just to a record number of immigrants in the United States, which is not unexpected. We have a bigger population, well over 50 million immigrants now. We now have the highest percentage of foreign-born people in our population ever recorded. And that's new, and that's a big deal. I mean, there's no decline projected. There's nothing going to happen that's going to make that go down. It's just going to go up unless policy changes the way Congress changed policy a century ago. So really, that's the starting point of the whole discussion, is that the numbers have now reached a level that is unprecedented.
Mark, first of all, I am so honored to have you on the show. Your writing and work on the topic of immigration is something I've had my eye on for as long as I've been sort of politically aware. And you can correct me if I have this wrong, but you've been at the Center of Immigration Studies for 30 years or so?
30 years.
Is that right?
Yeah, 30 years this year. I've been doing this before it was cool.
Yeah, I guess so. And when I started paying attention to this topic, I grew up in California, so immigration was kind of top of mind as I was sort of going through my formative years in politics. And I would see stuff on Center for Immigration Studies, and I would see it cited, Larry Oster or Steve Saylor or whomever. And at the time, while immigration, as Chris alluded to, was a central feature of American politics, the idea of being against immigration or opposed to mass immigration in the numbers that people were coming in then, let alone how they're coming in now, was something that was kind of on the fringe of politics, both left and right. Now, occasionally you'd have someone like Bernie Sanders on the left, or I remember at one point like the Sierra Club was even immigration restrictionist. But certainly on the right, that idea was, Pat Buchanan and then these sort of fringe internet elements. So I'm wondering, before we get into the meat of, what exactly is going on now? How do we remedy this situation? Can you help explain to our viewers how we got to this point? What was going on in the Republican Party and among conservatives through that long period of time since you started at the Center for Immigration Studies that has kept this issue on the sidelines?
I think the basic political fact is that there is a difference of opinion between elites and public on this issue. And that's true in all kinds of institutions. Whether it's labor unions, regular labor union members are much more restrictionist than the labor union institutions.
Right.
Black organizations are not restrictionist at all, but ordinary black Americans are much more restrictionist than their ostensible spokesman. And you have the same thing, or you had the same thing within the Republican Party as well. So you had really, a broad Republican electorate that was uncomfortable with mass immigration. It wasn't really, it was kind of an inchoate thing. It hadn't been given form and shape. I mean, Buchanan did to some degree, but the elite, for want of a better term, the sort of country club element that dominated the Republican Party didn't see it that way. And so you had this elite public divide that helped drive a lot of bad policy until it got to the point where you had somebody like Trump in 2016 snatch the nomination out from under, 16 or 17 other conventional Republicans who had not picked up this issue that was sitting there on the ground for them to pick up. Because even if they didn't, in other words, all those other Republicans, even if they weren't really super jazzed about mass immigration, they were still afraid of being called names by the New York Times, what have you. And so, it took somebody like Trump to kick the door open. And, he's got all kinds of shortcomings and all that. I mean, we all know that. But it took the bull in the china shop to do it because no one else was willing to talk about it at the elite level.
So, and my follow-on question here then is, the prevailing theory, what you would hear about this is the reason there was this mismatch between quote unquote elite opinion on this topic and the base's opinion on this topic is that illegal immigration provided cheap labor. And this was really just at bottom a sort of supply and demand question. People who own big companies, manufacturers, any institution that sort of depended on low-skilled labor wanted an abundance of illegal immigrants and even legal immigrants to keep wages down and to keep a steady supply of new employees. Now, my question is, A, is that story that we've heard over the decades the real story, and or is there something else sort of driving elite opinion on this question? For example, that it's also a way to manipulate the electorate in a certain way that keeps certain factions in power over others, perhaps. And then my secondary question then is something different now? Because just as an outside observer kind of looking at the landscape of immigration, I don't see a very productive illegal immigration force, labor force, that is. A lot of these people seem to be on welfare. They seem very clearly to be a net drain on the economy. So does that old argument about the economic motivations for bringing in illegal immigrants still obtain today? And if not, what now is the reason behind just the massive flooding of immigration?
The explanation of immigration is driven by the way it's usually put is the left likes it because it's cheap votes and the right likes it because it's cheap labor. There's something to that. It's just that it's incomplete, I think. Not everything is about money and power, as improbable as that may seem. There is a certain ideological element to it. On the left, obviously, they just don't believe in nationhood and borders, and they actually, in particular, don't believe in our nationhood and borders. But even on the right, there is a kind of, at certain level of the sort of elite level, a kind of post-nationalism or a little bit of, kind of embarrassment about too open expressions of patriotism, and that there's a sense that being against immigration is mean or bigoted. And in the case of sort of WASP folks, it's like none of us, I think, here are WASPs, but there's this sense of, my ancestors were mean to the Irish, and so it's almost like I have to compensate for that, even if they don't think it through that way. So it's not just materialist, because I'm not a Marxist here. It's a combination. I mean, man does not live by bread alone, and immigration is not driven by cheap labor alone. It's a combination of a kind of ideological, or maybe even more accurately, sort of a worldview that sees assertions of American sovereignty as somehow, icky, combined with the fact that yes, you also get cheap lawn service.
I'm quite curious too, even just for you personally, what brought you into it? What arguments or thoughts? Was it more economic? Was it more cultural? What kind of critiques of the existing immigration system were you seeing at that time that brought you into it? And have those, have the nature of those critiques or the empirical reality, have those changed since you first started really working on immigration?
That's actually a good question, because everybody who is on my side of this debate comes at it from different angles. Institutionally, when this movement started in the late 70s, really, in the 80s, it actually was driven by people concerned mainly by environmental or population concerns, along with some driven by social democratic kind of worker rights concerns. I came at it originally out of assimilation concerns. Specifically, bilingual education is kind of what drew me into it. I didn't speak English when I started kindergarten. I mean, I was born here, my parents were born here, but they spoke Armenian to us, English to each other, so I knew both. My dad flunked kindergarten because his English wasn't good enough. I didn't, but I didn't speak English. And, when you're 5 years old, especially if you've already watched cartoons and you understand it anyway, you pick it up like this. Kids do that. Bilingual education is what really got my initial attention as being an outrage, both for the immigrant kids themselves, but for the country as a whole, because the whole point of assimilation, the whole point of immigration is assimilation. It's to make these people into Americans. And so that's what drew me into it, although over time, my conclusion or my approach to it hasn't really changed. That's still a concern. But the way I look at the issue is that all of the concerns, assimilation, workforce, security, welfare, they're all the same thing. They're all different manifestations of the incompatibility of mass immigration with the goals and characteristics of a modern society. And if anything, the assimilation stuff has obviously gotten to be a bigger problem. Both because it's now easier to get here even than it was 30 years ago when I started, so it's physically easier to kind of live in two countries at the same time, but also much of our leadership class is basically checked out of America. I mean, they're not necessarily anti-American, although there's plenty of that, but they're certainly post-American. In our schools, our HR departments, you name it, and why would an immigrant want to become an American when the Americans don't even care about being American?
Lomez, Kindred Harvest Tea Company sent us both gift baskets, and I was very impressed. Have you been partaking in some of their products?
I have. I've been enjoying it. As the weather gets a little colder, I like to have more tea, especially in the afternoon. So I've been pouring myself a different cup of tea each afternoon. And I've been really enjoying, they have a great Moroccan mint blend, which I really enjoy. I had been sick for a while and I'd been drinking the immunity tea, which is great. And my wife also has started drinking the tea. And in fact, we are now running out. So we're going to need to re-up our Kindred Harvest samplings. They're really good, and I'm sure everybody would love them.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Mrs. Rufo has been enjoying the Kindred Harvest. She really likes it. It's a great company run by great people, and they've also taken extra care to make sure the product is only the finest quality teas, and also the tea bag itself, so that it doesn't inject microplastics into your system. This is something that they're doing that very few other companies are doing. And so if you're interested, I would highly recommend you go to kindredharvest.co. That's kindredharvest.co, and the promo code RUFO will get you 20% off. Order now, get it before the holidays. 10 out of 10 recommend.
Yeah, assimilation is something Chris and I have talked quite a bit about, and I'm curious to get your perspective on this, especially given that this is what first brought you to this subject. Obviously, one big piece of the assimilation puzzle is just the sheer number of immigrants you have here at any given time. But there also seems to be this question of a kind of change that happened at some point, maybe in the late 20th century, maybe before then. Maybe you can actually pinpoint for us maybe where some of these inflection points were, where we went from assimilation into a dominant, like, let's say, Anglo-Protestant culture as an aspirational idea that all of these immigrant groups, even if they held on to certain ethnic particularities, could try to sort of fold themselves into, and did, it seems to me, rather well for a large part of the 20th century. But then at some point, did something happen where that model changed or became unviable for some reason? Why? I guess the question is, have we abandoned this? Well, have we abandoned that kind of assimilational aspiration? And then secondly, if the answer is yes, if it's not there, well, then what then? How do we take the current population of immigrants, which you said at the top is the largest in history, largest foreign-born population in history, exceeding what happened in the Ellis Island wave? Okay, if we don't have assimilation in the way we did, what do we do? How do we come back to this?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, what happened is the 60s happened. Ironically, just as immigration was kind of accidentally restarted, we also went through these spasms about how we're terrible and America's evil and, hey, LBJ, how many babies did you kill today? And all that stuff from the 1960s. So that had nothing to do with immigration, but it changed the context into which immigration has happened. And so the first thing you do is you turn off the faucet. If your tub is overflowing, you turn the faucet off first. But is there hope for assimilation? In other words, can it even happen? I think it can. Actually, I'm relatively optimistic. I mean, I may be a pessimistic optimist, but I'm an optimist in the sense that our assimilative powers here are pretty powerful. Intermarriage is extremely widespread, and we still have maybe a rump portion, but some non-trivial portion of our leadership class which still does believe in America. And so it's not easy. I'm not saying I don't have any 8-point plan to restore American patriotism and self-confidence, but the first thing is reduce numbers. And doing that itself, and assertions of American sovereignty and confidence, like at the border even, itself has a kind of teaching function for immigrants that, okay, we actually are taking ourselves seriously, or at least more seriously. I had a boss who used to say, you teach people how to treat you. And we've been teaching immigrants to be ambivalent at best about being American. That's on us. No, Guatemalan single mom bringing her kid to school in LA is saying, well, now, Mr. School, make sure you teach her that, Washington was a phallocratic, slave-holding, whatever it is. That's us. We're making up that nonsense. And so we need to put our own houses in order, a house in order. But until we do that, we've got to turn the faucet off, or at least turn it way down.
It seems like the other point for optimism about assimilation relative to pure nations is that the demographic composition and the nations of origin for American immigrants into America are radically different and, in my view, much more favorable than those, for example, in Scandinavia, in the UK. The gap between cultures in the banlieue around Paris, let's say, the gap between the cultures there, as well as Europe's, kind of historical, doesn't have like a great historical example of domestic assimilation. But tell me more about the composition of America's immigrants now, and what is the gap between the two that still exists that we need to narrow? And is that also, would you agree that that's cause for optimism relative to others?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I tell this to my European counterparts because we have an international network of other restrictionist think tanks in France and Hungary and Jerusalem. And I tell the Europeans, we have real problems in the United States with immigration, but holy moly, I'm glad we have our problems and not your problems. I think most of the differences with regard to immigration for us, between us now and our historic experience, is mainly our changes in our society. We're a post-industrial, knowledge-based economy. We have a welfare state, things like this. But there is some element, a secondary element, in that the immigrants themselves are different than they were in the past. Not as different, and for us, much less so. But, I mean, just to put it frankly, large-scale Islamic immigration into non-Muslim societies creates problems. I mean, that's, Sam Huntington put that colorfully in his Clash of Civilizations book. And specifically for Europe, Europe exists in opposition to Islam. In other words, it exists only because Islam, in a sense, created Europe, almost. And so that's a very different thing than, Guatemalan or a Chinese coming to the United States. There's still some historical baggage. The Mexicans still have a certain amount of that, although, that can be exaggerated. But the immigrants coming here just don't have the same historical experience with us, and the vast majority of them, to be blunt about it, are not Muslim. And even our Muslim immigrants, we have a smaller Islamic population numerically than France does, even though we're, 6 times France's population. And our Muslim population is much more highly educated. They didn't come as bus drivers or factory workers, as engineers or doctors. And the third element is they're much more ethnically diverse, so that they all hate each other. In a normal way that, the ethnic groups don't get along. And so those things together, again, make our challenge much more solvable, even with regard to Islamic immigration, although there's exceptions, and the Somalis are a big one, where what you see is something more like what Europe is experiencing.
So, I mean, here's where the rubber meets the road. We mentioned that the first thing we got to do is turn off the spigot, okay? For any of these assimilationist, optimistic goals to make manifest, we first have to pause where we're at so we can actually absorb all these different peoples. And I've been thinking about 1924 and this sort of immigration moratorium that takes hold after this massive wave. And to the extent there's a parallel between what happened in the early part of the 20th century and what's happened now, I'm looking at that and I'm wondering, how could that be politically feasible? And maybe you could help just explain to listeners what happened in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, what was going on at the time? How did the anti-immigration interest help marshal public and political sentiment behind them to institute something like this? I mean, they were faced, if I'm remembering correctly, with a lot of the same charges of being racist and all these other things, and there was a kind of moral case against them as well as an economic case. But they overcame all of this and were able to shut down immigration. So maybe you could explain, how did that happen? And is there any potential parallel that we can draw for what we might do now?
Not to get too much into a history lesson, but Congress several times before World War I passed restrictions on immigration, numerical restrictions on legal immigration, and they were vetoed by both Republican and Democratic presidents. What changed, and then World War I came and immigration basically stopped because nobody could cross the Atlantic, immediately started right up again as soon as the war was over. And I think the key thing that changed, that sort of changed the balance of politics, was enough of the business community defected from the pro-immigration side because of fears of Bolshevism and anarchism. In other words, it was a kind of security concerns. It's not like, all the business people who were really kind of driving the bus as far as the politics goes back then shifted, but enough of them shifted because they figured basically, okay, I'll pay a nickel extra an hour in order not to be killed in my bed, is kind of to put it simply. Are there analogies today? I think probably. First of all, I think some non-trivial element of the tech community rethinking some immigration. There's still an issue with H-1Bs and all that, but there is openness, at least among sort of our current, not to be derogatory, but our current sort of robber baron element that is rethinking open immigration. I think actually we're not at the process where the stage where something's immediately going to happen on legal immigration. We're kind of in a transitional phase, because I think President Trump is a transitional figure, because he still views this issue through really kind of a generic Republican businessman perspective of legal good, illegal bad. It's just that he takes the illegal bad part seriously and means it, and that's a real change. But he's not a restrictionist. All the people working for him are, though, and the whole next cohort of Republican leaders on the right, JD, Governor DeSantis, Senator Schmidt, Senator Hawley, Senator Cotton, they're all actual legal immigration restrictionists. And so we're not at 1924 yet. Maybe we're sort of before World War I stage politically of this working its way through.
Did the American left in 1924 start to turn on this issue? I mean, you mentioned like the big industrialists, for example, started to see the threat of Bolshevism as a sort of deciding factor in changing their mind about this. But did the left say to themselves, look, we represent, and this is like the typical anti-immigration from the left position from the left is our union people are getting paid less because there's a higher supply of workers, and therefore this suppresses wages in a very straightforward one-to-one way. And our unions have less power when they are in competition with foreign labor. So was there something like that operating at the time that also convinced people on the left to move away from this kind of open borders position?
Absolutely. I mean, Samuel Gompers, who organized the AFL, was one of the leaders. He himself was an immigrant, an English-Jewish immigrant, but he was one of the leaders in the push to restrict immigration because specifically the kind of social democratic reasons you described. In fact, I always get a kick out of the fact that the Cato Institute's office here in Washington, and the Cato Institute is sort of the most over-the-top, unlimited immigration voice
bad.
there is. When you go out the front door, you look out to the park across the street, and it's a statue of Samuel Gompers. I always get a big kick out of that. But yes, and even some of the non-union progressives, the people, the settlement house movement, those folks were seeing that, there needed to be a pause to be able to kind of absorb and improve the standards of people. The problem is today, or the challenge is, that so much of the left is now explicitly post-American in a way that wasn't necessarily the case back then, and not as much anyway. Some people were, Horace Kalin and those guys. But the regular left was still patriotic, in fact, really into the 90s. You had Barbara Jordan, who was a civil rights leader, first black woman elected to Congress from the South, was the chairman of an immigration commission under Clinton, who called for reductions in legal immigration. So that's all been gone. That's all gone now, though. The left is now a cultural left, not an economic left, and that makes it much harder to change policy.
There's an interesting other angle to this that I think highlights and supports your thesis as well. Last year I did some reporting with a team on the Venezuelan gangs who were taking over the apartment buildings in Aurora, Colorado. This was during the campaign. You probably remember the story. One of the things that we did, though, through FOIA requests and other document gathering, is that we showed that not only were these Venezuelan gang members taking over apartment buildings, but in many cases, they were doing so while being subsidized by taxpayers. The Biden administration sent money to the state of Colorado, sent money to the cities of Denver and Aurora, which then distributed the cash to left-wing NGOs. And what would give me also less hope that the left will come around is that the organized labor left has been in irreversible decline for many decades, but the NGO kind of post-American left has been in the ascension and gets a huge amount of cash flooding through that system for resettlement, for housing, for services, for meals, for welfare programs. We've seen this again in Minneapolis. It strikes me, and people ask, like, why are they into this? And there is a very real sense, well, because it is good for them, both for votes, both for ideology, and also because the system they've set up, unlike the labor left of the previous century, actually rewards not just immigration, but immigration from the least capable demographics who are most dependent on services. And so have you thought about how to break that chain? Because it seems to me that unless you can break that relationship or break that system, you're going to have this being more and more entrenched.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer for it, but exactly what you're talking about is that immigration serves to import a client base for much of the left. Both a direct client base in the sense of people getting money, but also a kind of, I wouldn't even say a political base, but a rationale for bigger government, because now there's that many more people who rely on government services. And, you know, these organizations really are post-American. I mean, they don't, if not explicitly anti-American. So I don't have any good, honestly, I have no good ideas on that other than starving the beast. And what we found when Trump restricted refugee resettlement, and there's a whole group of NGOs that live off of State Department and HHS money for refugee resettlement. That's part of that complex. When he restricted it, they ended up, you know, shutting offices, laying off people. I mean, he was starving the beast. And so I think that it's reducing numbers is the way you're going to do that. But again, you know, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? In other words, that's an obstacle. The financial interests those guys have and their ideological opposition to limits on immigration is an obstacle to starving the beast in the first place. So I wish I had a better answer.
Where is this money coming from? I mean, I know there are federal grants and there's refugee resettlement programs, but is there other money coming into the system that's buoying these institutions?
Well, I mean, some of it is just regular welfare that isn't immigrant specific. In other words, there's the whole federal government basically is a kind of a valve to sluice money around the country after it takes it in. So, I mean, obviously, refugee resettlement is a big one that's specific to immigrants. But much of the rest of it is just the regular panoply of the welfare state, which is why Milton Friedman years ago famously said you can't have open immigration and a welfare state. His argument was, well, let's get rid of the welfare state. And when libertarians tell me that, I say, okay, well, do that and then give me a call and then we'll talk about immigration. But they never get to that point.
Well, some of those libertarians are even, that's like their implicit or even explicit strategy. Some of the guys at Cato Institute, they're like, we want to create social dysfunction. We want to have large scale fraud. We love, Somalis looting Minnesota, because eventually the public will be convinced to cut welfare programs. And I'm thinking like, this is like like an infinite trick shot in pool, that bounces off the wall and then goes to the corner and then sinks the 8-ball. And it's like, politics doesn't work like that. And actually, if you look at the numbers, Americans, again, I would wish it were not so, but Americans overwhelmingly support most of these programs. And so it doesn't actually chip away at the welfare. But tell us, hopefully optimistically, the other case, what do the numbers look like when you poll Americans about immigration restriction, about some of these particular policies? What do the numbers look like now, and has that been a change from 10, 15, 20 years ago?
Well, specifically in the kind of the short run, there's widespread support for for deporting people with criminal convictions, which is, a kind of a gimme almost. But even there's still majority support for deporting illegal immigrants, even if they're not criminals. Now that may erode because, you know, the media is on the warpath on, you know, trying to problematize deportation. But the bigger question of immigration numbers, the support for cutting immigration was very high. It actually kind of peaked when Newt Gingrich took over Congress for the first time. Republicans took over the Congress for the first time in a couple of generations. And there was legislation. There were several years of back and forth. And specifically, Spencer Abraham, senator from a Republican, ostensibly senator from Michigan, is the one who sabotaged that quite effectively. The actual legislative reductions in immigration that were actually in Congress. I mean, it was a real thing. Since then, the numbers have gone up and down. There's more and more, you know, the immigrant share of the population goes up. So, people who, and so that affects numbers. The numbers in favor of reducing immigration went way up under Biden because of the disaster he created at the border and kind of, I hate to keep using this sociology word or whatever it is, but problematized immigration in general, tainted the whole thing. And so a lot of people were saying, yeah, we need the whole thing reduced. In a sense, Trump could be a victim of his own success because now that the border is, you know, the lowest number of crossings really since, honestly, not even the 60s. We're at the lowest number of crossings since like the 19th century.
Wow.
But that makes it for a lot of people, out of sight, out of mind. And so, this is why we still have a debate over whether we should be reducing immigration. And we haven't won yet, but I'm optimistic.
So as the numbers and the polling sort of fluctuates and goes up and then down, and people are more or less relieved as, you know, the border enforcement becomes more robust, and then they become more aware of the problem as border enforcement weakens, et cetera. Is there any sense that when those spikes happen, one, that translates into policy? Because my impression here is that it kind of doesn't matter. Congress doesn't seem to react meaningfully to these spikes when they do happen. So that's one. And then the flip side of that is when there are immigration enforcement actions that go into that become policy, whether it's deportations or these ICE raids or anything else that might happen, maybe it's strengthening the border. Does that rub people the wrong way? Because there's this argument that the moment you try to enforce illegal immigration and get people out of the country, this creates a kind of sentimentality, and it creates these narratives that are used by the left to turn people's opinion on this. And it becomes really difficult to do anything meaningful, because the moment you do anything meaningful, there's suddenly this pretty large backlash against you. Okay, so how do we get around this problem?
My grad school advisor used to say, in the foreign policy context, but it applies here too, the American people are in favor of all steps short of action. And, there is some element of that with regard to immigration. Now, the president came into office with a significant amount of political capital on this because of Biden's disastrous tenure. And so the thing is, what I'm afraid of is two things. The administration won, obviously, president won the election. They, I think, are not taking seriously enough the need to keep campaigning on this, because every day is election day, especially on this immigration issue. And the other thing that I'm concerned about is that they have an imbalance in the enforcement they're doing. You have to have guys in body armor arresting people in the street. That's an essential element of enforcement. It can't be the whole thing. They've got to do work site related enforcement. And that doesn't mean it's raids at work sites. That also means, Social Security no match letters, where if you send in your info, you're an employer, you send your payroll stuff, information to Social Security, well, the name doesn't match the number, Social Security sends you a letter. And because most illegal immigrants work on the books with fake or stolen numbers. And so they need to leverage that and say, look, we're going to do enforcement of guys with briefcases as well as guys with body armor. And the briefcase enforcement, if you will, is they're not doing enough of that. And that is one of the things that makes that's less provocative for the public. But arguably,
it strikes me as if you were really interested in doing so, you could bring in, an artificial intelligence company. You could open up the database for all of the employment registration and unleash this matching, searching, and verification tool. And very quickly, you could have a roster of perhaps even tens of millions of people. You would have their employment information, banking information, other information. And so am I correct in assuming that they don't want to do this? And if so, why?
Let me put it this way. My sense is there's ambivalence about it. Because remember, in the summer, the president said, well, we're going to go easy on the farmers and the hotel and restaurant industry because they use so many illegals.
I cherish our farmers. And when we go into a farm and we take away people that have been working there for 15 and 20 years who are good, who possibly came in incorrectly, and what we're going to do is we're going to do something for farmers where we can let the farmer sort of be in charge. The farmer knows he's not going to hire a murderer. But, when you go into a farm and he's had somebody working with him for 9 years doing this kind of work, which is hard work to do, and a lot of people aren't going to do it, and you end up destroying a farmer because you took all the people away, it's a problem. I'm on both sides of the thing. I'm the strongest immigration guy that there's ever been, but I'm also the strongest farmer guy that there's ever been. And that includes also hotels and, places where people work, a certain group of people work. So we're working on it right now. We're going to work it so that some kind of a temporary pass where people pay taxes, where the farmer can have a little control as opposed to you walk in and take everybody away.
There is, that's sending mixed messages, very much so. And so this isn't really a technical problem. This isn't a statutory problem. I mean, there are legal changes we need, but that's not the real issue. This isn't a question of will. When ICE raided a farm in California, I don't know if you remember that. It was earlier this year. It was a marijuana farm. And that was and nobody told me this, but it was obviously a curated operation where they picked a marijuana farm owned by a hedge fund guy that was employing illegal alien children. So it's like it's like a perfect storm of the most obvious place you should raid. And ICE behind the scenes still got crap for that from certain people in the administration. And so this is a problem that
on what grounds? That this was like an optics problem?
No, is that it was raiding an employer, and they're people who don't want employers to get raided.
Are these people like older school country club Republicans, or are they like, what is the culture of this group of people within the administration who's pushing back? You can say names if you want, but give me a sense of the
I
wouldn't
say it's a group in the sense it's a coherent, sort of cohesive faction. It's just that there are a lot of people in the administration who are pro-business, which is fine. I'm pro-business, but have this sense that they don't want to inconvenience employers too much. Now, they can rationalize this. Well, we have an election. We don't want to cause economic problems for us before the midterms, this kind of thing. But you're not going to get this, illegal immigration problem under control until you make it as almost impossible to get and keep a job if you're an illegal alien. That needs to be more important than sending ICE guys out to arrest people on the street.
It also strikes me as just more defensible publicly because there's a high variability in sending armed men into, a rough neighborhood in Chicago and dragging people out of their homes. You should do it. If they're criminals, you have to do it. But it strikes me as you can get a George Floyd moment that way. You can get a public opinion in opposition. You give local Democrat mayors and such a rallying point for protests. Whereas the paperwork and the legalistic technical approach, you reduce almost all of those vulnerabilities. It's simply saying we're going to lock you out of the system because you're cheating. Is it just that they're worried about hotel employers and construction firms, and is it sympathy to the business owner, or like I'm really struggling to understand this
My
opposition.
sense is, and look, my understanding of the workings is incomplete here, but yes, my understanding is that again, this is from the president on down. There is discomfort with causing too much dislocation for hotels industries, for the restaurant industry, for the construction industry.
Yeah. Oh, I have a look. I find this unconvincing on its face, and I think our ordering of priorities here has to place doing something about this mass immigration problem before these sort of economic concerns for hotel owners or whatever. However, let me try to be sympathetic or understand this position, and it would go something like, look, and you hear this every now and then, we would love to do this, but there aren't American workers, okay? We need to have a functional business. We need to be able to run our restaurant. We need to be able to run our hotel. I have a farm, and I can't let my crops rot in the fields. I need people out there to go pick the strawberries or whatever the case may be. And it just is the case that if I'm a housing developer and we need housing, well, I need these illegal immigrants to come do the grunt work, because if you were to just tomorrow enforce these policies and kick these people out of the country, our industry would come to a halt. And it wouldn't just come to a halt for like a day or a week. We would not be able to find native replacements for the people who were letting go. Okay, that I imagine is something like the argument that's being articulated in these meetings. Is there any validity to that argument, and or what does it get wrong?
There is there's a limited validity to it, because if you do in fact flush all the illegal aliens out of the labor market overnight, that would be disastrous. It would be imprudent. I mean, it's just that we've created this situation for ourselves, and to go cold turkey may work for an individual who's hooked on dope or alcohol, but it would have real problems. But the reason I don't take that as a deal killer is that reducing the illegal population is a process. It's not an event. It's something that happens, that unfolds over a period of time. And we have the highest percentage of working age native born men who are not even in the labor force.
Yeah.
In other words, they're not working, but they're not even looking for work, so they're not even counted as unemployed. Now, a lot of those people have human capital problems, to put it kind of bloodlessly. Absolutely, they do. And it's our problem, and we're not going to deal with that if employers can just hire somebody else to do the work. That's number one. But the other point I wanted to make on this sort of issue of gradualism is the administration recently issued a regulation reducing the minimum wages that farmers have to pay for guest workers, for agricultural guest workers. Reduced it. What they need to be doing is set out a kind of a schedule of 5 years in the future, that every year what they have to pay is going to go up, so that it's predictable and it becomes more expensive, and at the same time fund mechanization research and maybe even loan guarantees to buy a radish harvester or what have you, to wean these people off, because a transition is not going to happen until there's an economic incentive, an economic need to make the transition.
So this seems to me
go ahead.
Real quick, this seems to me a structural problem, because, if it is the case that there are legitimate concerns about just doing this in a kind of blitz, and a gradual process to do this prudently, where you're not, torpedoing the economy, is, let's say, like a 5-year process at minimum. I imagine it might even be longer than that, depending on what kind of labor force you need to train up and how quickly you can sort of move these pieces around. But are Political cycles happen like on a 2-year basis or happen much more quickly than that. And people want action now. And if they don't get action now, they either kind of forget or they go to somewhere else. And it's like hard to sustain a project, a deportation project, or this weaning off of our dependency on illegal immigration, given the discontinuity between how much time that would take on the one hand and how quickly political cycles happen on the other hand. So, I don't want to be a pessimist. I think this is the most pressing, literally the most pressing problem in American public life. But how do you manage that time discrepancy?
Yeah, I don't have a systemic answer to that, but I do have a messaging answer. And that is, immigration hawks need to talk more about the positive consequences of reducing immigration. We've started to talk some about housing costs, this sort of thing. JD has been talking about that.
Yeah.
But for instance, the whole point of reducing immigration is you tighten the labor market. And what that means is that marginal workers have more bargaining power. People who have nothing but their two hands are in a better position, and make that, put some flesh on the bones. For instance, if you're an ex-con, you have trouble getting hired, and rightly so, because frankly, probably half of them are dirtbags. But what about the other half who want to rebuild their lives? They have a much better shot at getting hired if there aren't 17 Guatemalans trying to get the same job. Same with a recovering addict. Same with an American kid who's cognitively disabled, but not so much that he can't work. Same with a single mom who needs flexible work hours and can't find a job that gives her the flexibility. That's the kind of thing that can create a kind of public sense that there's a positive good for people coming out of this, rather than simply talking about getting rid of the rapists and murderers, which everybody's for.
That's really, I guess, my big question about the Trump administration, not just related to immigration, but related to, many other domains, is that they have, I think, demonstrated and a much improved sophistication about how to message, how to deal with the media, how to drive headlines, how to garner attention for various programs and policies. But I do always wonder on the back end, okay, well, are you going to do it? Is this just a tweet, or is this a directive, or is this a directive that is followed on with action? And I'll give you another example for the Antifa executive order. We're designating Antifa a domestic terror organization, and we're going to, route Antifa, militants, radicals, illegal criminal networks, etc. But for me, the question is, okay, when do I get to see all of the mugshots? Because until we see the mugshots, it's just talk. And I guess, do you have a similar fear about immigration? Is there a sense that they are doing dramatic raids, that Kristi Noem, does her hair nicely and goes out with a bulletproof vest and a pink AR? But are they going to get the job done so that in 3 years, at the end of this term, will there be, a significant reduction in the number of illegal immigrants?
I don't think the problem is that this is all just press releases and tweets. In other words, they are doing actual things that are actually having results. I mean, our research showed that from January through July, the total foreign-born population seems to have declined by 2.2 million, of which 1.6 million were illegal aliens. And that's a net number, so the actual number was more. And that was, again, through July, so I'm confident in saying the illegal population has dropped by a good 2 million people by now, almost certainly. So there are actual results because they are actually doing things. Do I want them to do more? Are there other things? Absolutely. But it's not just a, sort of press releases and tweets with no follow-up. My concern is the opposite, is that we need more press releases and tweets showing the benefits of reducing immigration. Like having the First Lady go to a prisoner reentry program where they train young people who spent 18 months in jail for some, drug offense and are now trying to rebuild their lives, and how this is the kind of thing that immigration limits will help, because now these people are going to be in more demand. Employers that might look askance at hiring some guy who, just got out of jail are going to be much more open to it, just because they don't have the Ecuadorians they used to employ.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Donald Trump comes to you, Stephen Miller comes to you and says, Mark, we're going to make you immigration czar. Okay. And
I'm not holding my breath on that one. But.
Okay. All right. We're a year in. We got 3 years left of the current term. No expectation or guarantee that we're going to have control of Congress, or even if we did, that they would work on our behalf. So leave legislation out of it for the moment. What are the things you are doing over the next 3 years that you think are going to be the most bang for your buck as far as immigration enforcement goes, doing something about reversing what happened in the Biden administration over the last 4 years? And now, as a bonus question, assuming you do a good job, J.D. Vance is going to hire you for his entire term. And now you do have, the Senate, the House, everything to do whatever you want. Okay, you have carte blanche here.
And 60 votes in the Senate.
What does the
All right,
Krikorian
full fantasy land
immigration regime look like in these two scenarios?
So in the short term, it's only going to be regulatory changes. But when you lock things into regulation, they can be undone. But it's harder, but it takes some doing to undo them. And so, one of the most important things they need to do to make sure this Biden doesn't happen again is regulations prohibiting the issuance of work permits to anyone who doesn't warrant one in the law. Presidents have been giving work permits to all kinds of illegal aliens, spouses of visitors, all kinds of stuff, millions of work. And when you have a work permit, it's game over. You've essentially been amnestied. It doesn't matter what you call it. That's number one. Number two, in regulation, they need to limit what is called parole, which is one of the main tools Biden used to just let in people who had no right to be here. They're inadmissible, and it's supposed to be used for very narrow purposes, like you need a drug dealer to come and testify at a trial. He is inadmissible. It is illegal to give him a visa. But you parole him in, you drive him to the courthouse, he says his thing, you drive him back to the border, and that's the end of it. That's what it's for. Biden used it to let in millions of illegal aliens. So there are regulations. You can do regulatory changes that prohibit that. Now, President Gavin Newsom could undo them, but it becomes harder to undo. Now, during the 8 years of the J.D. Vance administration, there's all kind. I would reduce legal immigration to husbands, wives, and little kids of American citizens, which is a lot of people, 300 to 400,000 people a year. So that's not nothing. And then a handful of Einsteins, and maybe some humanitarian immigration, although I've gotten way more hardcore on that than I used to be. There's a whole bunch of enforcement-related tightening that it needs to be in legislation, prohibiting parole beyond maybe a few thousand a year.
And are you gutting H-1B, gutting OPT? Yeah.
OPT is, for those people who don't follow all these initials, it's totally illegal anyway. It's just made up by the Bush administration, expanded by the Obama administration. It allows foreign students who aren't students anymore to continue masquerading as students, but basically just work. It's a labor program. So I would get rid of H-1B. There's no rationale for it all. That should just be eliminated. I'll live with restrictions. I'm a incrementalist, but it really shouldn't exist at all. So
but have some mechanism for top talent, like the O1 genius visas.
There's the O visa. There's the EB1 category of permanent green cards. So I'm for Einstein immigration, but how many Einsteins does humanity produce in any given year? You know what I mean? People talk about how our the rocket industry was created by Germans we brought over after World War II, Operation Paperclip. Yeah, well, we brought in about 100 people a year for 15 years. I'm for that. You know what I mean? That's not what we're talking about now.
Yeah.
I mean,
And on the legislative side,
just so
is it
Media
even
Matters
worth?
doesn't make an issue of it, the Nazi part was bad. Okay.
No, you're good. Yeah, of course. We condemn, we disavow. But is it even worth considering a legislative approach, or is the threshold in the Senate so high that it isn't a good use of time?
I think there are. It's a tough hill to climb, but I don't think it's impossible. The Lake and Riley Act was passed with some Democratic votes, which doesn't fix everything, but it has some important elements to it. There are specific things that could be done. For instance, H-1B reform has repeatedly been championed by Dick Durbin, Democratic Senator Durbin, and Chuck Grassley, the Republican senator. So if legislation stays targeted, there are potential small areas where we could get moving. The problem is, anytime you do any immigration legislation, every member of Congress says, oh, my thing needs to be added to this. And you end up with a Christmas tree. This is why the president would need to take leadership and say, I will sign a bill that does these two things, and I will veto anything that has barnacles added to it. That's it. Maybe it could work, but it would take leadership from the president and from the congressional leadership to do that.
Okay, and on this same note, like over the next few years, you've talked about these different categories of illegal immigrants or quasi-legal immigrants who really ought not to be here, but for these abuses of a variety of different loopholes. And I just don't think, as a practical matter, there are enough people to enforce their removal. Like, we can't send out a big enough army of ICE officers to go find each and every one of them and get them out of the country. So there's this concept of remigration. I'm certain you've heard of it, and it's this idea of creating a certain amount of carrots and sticks to induce voluntary return from wherever somebody might be from, or at least to get them to leave, maybe go somewhere else. Maybe they go to Canada or Mexico or somewhere else. So what are, and as a general concept, I find this very appealing. What does this look like in practice? Is this possible? Are there ways to incentivize people packing up their bags and leaving this place, even if we're not enforcing it through more aggressive means?
Absolutely. And we've championed this for years. We call it attrition through enforcement. But the point is attrition of the total illegal population, and would be presumably maybe even some of the legal population.
Right.
Yeah. The point is, the starting point is to understand that there's always churn in the immigrant population anyway. People are always leaving as well as coming in. Even under Biden, there were illegal aliens leaving for their own reasons. They failed at what were they doing? Or maybe they succeeded, earned enough money to buy the cab back in Accra, Ghana, and then went home. That kind of thing happens all the time. So the answer is let in fewer people, get more people to leave. In other words, change the relationship. And making it hard to get a job is one of the most important elements of that. Also, locking illegal immigrants out of the banking system is essential. And I mean, the Bush and Obama administrations actually made it easier for banks to offer banking services to illegal immigrants. Those are the two big areas. I don't think requiring landlords to check the legal status of renters is going to work, just because it's such a dispersed and diversified thing. But employment and banking and driver's license is the other thing. Identification is those three. I think making it as practically impossible as you can get for illegal immigrants to be able to do those things makes it hard to live here, but also sends a message, has a kind of teaching function that the party's over and you need to leave.
And I'd be curious, as we wrap up the hour, having studied this, having worked on this over a 3-decade period, having really being in opposition to the consensus on both parties for much of that time. And now seeing these ideas come to life and have a huge tangible impact. What's that been like personally for you to see it the first term and now the kind of triumphant return of the second Trump term? I mean, just on a personal basis, looking back over that span of time, what kind of feelings and conclusions come to mind?
I mean, there's a certain vindication you feel. In other words, I think you can take it too far. We haven't won. There's all kinds of things that have to happen. But as Churchill said, this isn't the end. This isn't even the beginning of the end. But it is maybe the end of the beginning. And in fact, this is the first time in my entire 3 decades here that we've actually lost staff to an administration. This is what think tanks, this is what happens with think tanks, in normal think tanks, right or left. People go into administration, they come out, that kind of thing. This has literally never happened in the immigration space before, and I've lost 15% of my staff. It was pretty small to begin with, and that's a good problem to have. So it boosts my sense of optimism that we are going to be able to kind of slowly move this aircraft carrier in a different direction. Even if doesn't go everywhere I want it to go, it's going to be moving closer to where it needs to be going. So I'm actually quite pleased.
That's great. And Mark, if anyone's earned it, it's you. And so where can people, if people want to support Center for Immigration Studies, which I recommend everybody does, I really do think, and I don't mean to make this sound exaggerated, there's really no amount of hyperbole that can do justice to the work you guys have done over the years. So if people want to contribute to the cause at your think tank, how might they do that? Also, where can they find your work? And is there anything else you want to point our listeners in the direction of?
Our website is cis.org. We have a matching gift campaign going on through the end of the year. So there's a donate button there for those people who want to support us in that way. We have new blog posts almost every day. You can sign up for our email list. We don't paper you over with new emails. We don't sell it to anybody. So there's no danger, but you see what's going on. And the other thing I'd suggest is, if people have a taste for snark and sarcasm, they can follow me on Twitter. It's spelled X, but it's still pronounced Twitter, at Mark S, as in Stephen, Mark S. Krikorian.
Awesome. Well, it's been great to have you. Great to hear about these successes, and really appreciate it.
Well, I'm delighted to have been invited. You guys have a great show, and both of you are really doing fantastic work.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate it.